Okay, so we're going to get into Thomas Jefferson's first term. And where we just came from was the election of 1800, which was the rematch between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Remembering John Adams won the first, which would be 1796, and now in 1800, Thomas Jefferson won, so he becomes our third president. These focus questions are the ones that you've already written down or should have already written down. And if you haven't, you should do that now. We've got two of them here that we have answered already. The first one, in the election of 1800, which two candidates tied in the Electoral College? And those two candidates, if you remember, were Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was supposed to be Thomas Jefferson's vice president. But the way the Electoral College worked is they actually kind of made a mistake. The Democratic Republican electors made a mistake, and so both of those candidates tied. And so in the case of a tie, which is your second question there, the election goes into the House of Representatives. And so when this election went into the House of Representatives, if you remember the whole story, it became a little bit of a mess in the House of Representatives. But ultimately what happened was Thomas Jefferson won. So Thomas Jefferson, third president. Our third question there, what's the purpose of the 12th Amendment? This is the one that you haven't answered yet, which we are actually going to answer right now. So we've had 4 elections so far. The first 2 with George Washington, and both of those were sort of foregone conclusions that Washington would win. Nobody seriously ran against him. So there was no problems there. But then in 1796 and again in 1800, the Electoral College got all goofed up again. And so what they decided to do to kind of fix this is they passed the 12th Amendment. And prior to the 12th Amendment in the Electoral College, each elector, if you remember, had 2 votes of equal value. Okay, so each elector would vote for 2 candidates. The candidate that had the most votes would be president. The candidate who came in second place would be vice president. Well, as it turns out, that doesn't work very well because things get messed up and there's ties and there's all kinds of trouble. So what they decided to do was change to where each elector would still have 2 votes, but they would actually be separate. So they would vote separately for president and for vice president on a separate vote. Okay, so they wouldn't share votes anymore. They were separate, a vote for president and a vote for vice president. And then that would fix all of the problems that had happened in the prior 2 elections. All right, now Thomas Jefferson looked at the election of 1800. He called it the Revolution of 1800. And why he looked at it that way was because you had the United States, which was run by the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party controlled the executive branch. They controlled the legislative branch. So they had the president, they had the House of Representatives, they had the Senate, they had everything. Okay. Then the election of 1800 happened, and the Federalists lost everything. They lost the Senate, they lost the House of Representatives, and of course they lost the presidency as well. Now, what made that unique was that sort of thing generally, especially in these days, generally wouldn't happen without any, people shooting bullets at each other, right? One group of people doesn't often want to give up power to another group of people, so they'll fight against it. In most places, that would end up in a, pretty serious situation. But in the United States, it was basically a peaceful passage of power between the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. Now, that doesn't mean the Federalists thought it was great, and John Adams had a little tantrum over it. But on the day that Jefferson was supposed to take office, Jefferson took office, right? And so that's why he thought of it as a revolution of 1800, because that sort of thing just didn't happen in the world, but it happened here. All right. From basically the moment Jefferson took office, he did things differently. Washington and Adams both were kind of big in the kind of the image of the presidency, maybe. Washington kind of could pull it off. Adams maybe a little less, but Jefferson wasn't that way at all. When he had his uh, day where he was going to become president, kind of two things usually happen there. One, president takes the oath of office, and then two, they'll often give a inaugural speech, right? So Jefferson, on that day when he was going to take the oath of office, he just walked to the Capitol. He didn't have some big fancy white horse like Washington rode, or some big fancy. He just walked, just wore normal clothes. And then when he gave his inaugural address or his inaugural speech, he was actually real quiet. They said that people actually had a really hard time even understanding what he was saying because he was so quiet. But what he did say is that, basically he was going to be the president for everybody, supported the will of the majority, tried to let Federalists know that he wasn't going to come in and try and be vindictive or anything like that. He's going to rule fairly. And that was kind of the tone that he set right from the start. Now, this question, what is Jeffersonian democracy? This is going to be kind of the first part of your assignment. And what I want you to do is, in your focus questions, write down what is Jeffersonian democracy. And then using your book, pages 268 and 269, begin to answer that. You're going to probably want to go out into the internet to sort of finish that answer. You'll start there on 268 and 269. So as you're doing this, you can just pause here for a second, go do that thing, and then come back. And hopefully you're back with that done now. All right, so now when he took office, the Democratic Republican Party, like we had said, had won the executive branch, had won the presidency, and had won the legislative branch as well. So it took control of the House of Representatives, took control of the Senate, meaning there were more representatives and senators that were part of the Democratic Republican Party than were part of the Federalist Party. And what that meant for Jefferson was he was going to be able to do the things that he wanted much easier. Because if you had a situation where you had a president of one party and then a Congress of another party, well, Congress is going to block the things the president wants to do. The president is going to block the things that Congress wants to do. But if it's both the same party, then basically what Congress wants to do is what the president wants to do. What the president wants to do matches what Congress wants to do. So they're going to be able to get some things done, right? So that was what Jefferson was looking at going into office, was a Congress that was going to be friendly to his ideas, to the things that he wants to do. Congress is going to be open to them. So that, for Jefferson, that was something that he would be very happy about. Now in your focus questions, also write down this chart. Okay, so on one side you've got Federalist policies, and these would be things that were in place already under John Adams, thing that when Jefferson took office would be there already in place. And then Republican policies would be things that the Democratic Republican Party wanted to do. Okay, so we've got Federalist policies, we've got Republican policies. And the Federalist policies, Jefferson was going to have to look at and decide what to do with them. Okay, so I've got a couple examples of some of those policies. The first one were the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if you remember back to John Adams, he's sort of mostly remembered for two things. The first one being good, XYZ affair, kept us out of war with France. People look back at him and say, well done. The second thing, people look back and say, that was not very well done, and that would be the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if you remember, basically what the worst part of those was, if you spoke out against the government, you had a shot of ending up in jail or fined. Now, the Federalists put that in place basically and used it to attack Democratic Republican newspapers. So you get into a freedom of the press question here, where they jailed, shut down, fined a bunch of editors of these newspapers. So Jefferson, from the get-go, had been very opposed to these. Said, well, one, they violate the First Amendment. So when he took office, these laws were actually still in place, but shortly thereafter they were set to expire. So when they had originally passed these laws, what they said was, these are going to be the laws until this date, and when that date happens, the law either disappears or Congress kind of re-ups it. And Jefferson told Congress to just let it expire, right? He said, this law is no good. We want rid of it. So the first then of the Federalist policies, Alien and Sedition Acts, let them go away. That's how Jefferson reacted to that. Second one was taxes, and specifically in this example, the whiskey tax. So in general, Jefferson was opposed to taxes, right? He wanted an agricultural-based country, and in his opinion, taxes were bad for that. So he wanted to get rid of those taxes. And the whiskey tax specifically had been one, if you remember, was the tax behind the Whiskey Rebellion. So Jefferson takes office and he says, we're flat going to get rid of that. And that had been around. That was Alexander Hamilton's tax. And Jefferson says, we're getting rid of it. So second Federalist policy, the whiskey tax, repeal it. Repeal meaning get rid of it. So get rid of the tax. Then you had some Democratic Republican policies that Jefferson wanted to put in place. And here's a couple examples of those. One of them was he wanted to significantly cut the military, and wanted to cut it to the Army of being 3,200 troops and the Navy just 7 ships. So his idea is that he was going to make the military very small, which meant cheap. And then his idea was he was going to use those savings to pay off the national debt, was his idea. And the national debt still was hanging out there. Hamilton had never gotten it paid off. And so Jefferson, this was his plan to get it paid off. And spoil the surprise, he didn't get it paid off. But that was his plan. The other policy then was kind of in line with the whiskey taxes. He wanted to get rid of domestic taxes on the people. Okay, so cut military spending, use those savings to pay off the debt, and then continue to cut domestic taxes more so than even just the whiskey tax, like kind of across the board. Now, the last Federalist policy here was one that Jefferson initially was opposed to. If you remember all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and his 5-part plan to get the country out of debt, one of the parts of that plan was to have a national bank. And Jefferson at the time, super opposed to it. If you remember, that was the whole loose construction versus strict construction bit. And Jefferson said, Constitution, this would be a loose construction idea. The Constitution does not say the federal government can have a bank, so we cannot have a bank. Period. Washington, if you remember, said, we're going to go ahead and have a bank. And so the bank had been in place for several years, and Jefferson looked at it and he said, well, you know what? That bank kind of actually works pretty well, so we're going to go ahead and keep that. So that was one of the Federalist policies then that Jefferson kept. Okay. Now, beyond that, the way that the two parties reacted to Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, of course, were excited that he was president. One of the things that he didn't, or that the Democratic Republican Party ended up not liking that Jefferson did, was when he took office, the Federalists had been in power, so there were a bunch of Federalists in jobs all across the federal government. And Jefferson's party expected him basically to fire all those people, put in Democratic Republicans in those jobs. Jefferson did not do that. So he said if there are people in these jobs, Federalists or not, remember back to his inaugural address, he said, I'm going to, not, try to wipe the Federalists out, or, where I'm going to be the president for everybody. And so he said, if there are Federalists in some of these jobs that are doing well, we're just going to keep them in those jobs, right? If they're doing a good job, there's no reason to get rid of them. So we're not going to. And his party was upset about that because they wanted him to get rid of all the Federalists in those jobs, but he didn't. Then the Federalists, they were upset mainly, well, because they lost, basically power. But one of the big things that Jefferson did that they were upset about were the military cuts, making the military so small. They said that really put the country in danger. An army of 3,200, a navy of 7 ships, really put the country in danger. And so they were upset about that with Jefferson. All right, so now we're going to get to your assignment, which will be attached to today as well. Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison, and it'll be basically a terms assignment. So look for that, and we'll see you next time.